There are several Dallas Cowboys rumors swirling in Indianapolis. We'll break them all down on this episode of the Locked On Cowboys podcast.
You are Locked On Cowboys, your daily Dallas Cowboys podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Landon McCool. You can follow him on Twitter at McCoolBCB. Landon, we've got plenty of Dallas Cowboy rumors to get to, but before we start, I want to let you know some breaking news. I did not get into a fight at Starbucks this morning with another NFL insider, so it was a good, successful morning here.
Well, maybe next year you'll reach the level of kind of notoriety that was required to being attacked at a Starbucks. But, until then, keep grinding away.
I'm working on it. Yeah, that's a nice coffee reference. Keep grinding. There you go. All right, let's talk about some Cowboy rumors. A bunch of them came out on Thursday morning. Let's start with the ones that we think are probably the most viable. Our guy Mike Fisher is reporting that the Dallas Cowboys are nearing an extension with Osa Odighizuwa, their star defensive tackle, on a deal upwards of $21 million per year, which would pay him somewhere between like the 10th and 14th highest paid defensive tackle in the league. First of all, your thoughts on the news, and if those numbers are correct, did the Cowboys overpay?
No. First of all, I don't think if the Cowboys got that, they did not overpay, and I'm actually thrilled with the number if that's the number, right? Like, because you and I have been talking about, we assumed that the number would come in somewhere between the transition tag number and the franchise tag number, right? With the possibility being that the defensive tackle market does explode and suddenly, the starting point is the franchise number, but it doesn't look like that's the case. If all of this is true. And it looks like, 21 million, I think, is a reasonable, decent number for the Cowboys to get Osa at, especially considering his production as a pass rusher. And then if all of this is true, this is very exciting, right? Like, this is great news. I think a lot of us, even a few weeks ago, would have suggested that Osa leaving was a foregone conclusion, right? The fact that they would be able to bring him back, it pretends kind of another positive, good faith step towards them kind of keeping their word as to what they said that their offseason plan was, to be a little bit more aggressive in free agency, to kind of make some changes in how they are, acquiring players during this period. And I think it also kind of portends potential, getting off on the right foot with Micah Parsons, right? Because they suggested, or Steven suggested, that they were going to try to get Osa done, and then that they were right on to Micah Parsons right after that, and that they didn't have anything necessarily kind of holding them up, like they did with CD and the circumstances regarding all the wide receivers that were also looking for contracts at that time. So I think if all of this is true, it's another sound, solid step towards kind of putting their money where their mouth is, maybe literally, about how they're going to approach this offseason and the difference between this and last year.
So many different angles to break down. First of all, when the news kind of came out this morning, and again, we have no reason to believe that Mike Fisher isn't telling the truth here. This has been the Cowboys' plan for a while. Those are the numbers that we've been hearing. I'm not surprised that he would take a deal around 21 million with Dallas versus going out and maybe getting 23, maybe even $24 million elsewhere. There's no state income tax in Dallas, and that makes a big deal. You also don't have to relocate your family and all that stuff. Right. So 21 in Dallas is probably the equivalent to 23, 24 elsewhere. So to me, those numbers make sense, right? The thing is do you think it's worth it to re-sign Osa? And I've seen a lot of fans and Cowboy reporters like pushing back, like, hey, this is a lot of money to give a not very productive player. I don't understand this at all. Osa, like, if you watch the games, Osa's really good. Now, is he a top 5 defensive tackle in the league? No, but you're paying him as like the 10th, 12th, 14th best defensive tackle in the league. And I think he's better than that.
I mean, I'd argue he's a top 5 pass rushing defensive tackle in the league.
Well, I mean, last year alone, he finished 4th in pass rush win rate, among qualifying defensive tackles, and first in quarterback hits. And I know there is still a section of fans out there that only care about the sacks, but pass rush win rate and QB hits is a pretty good indicator that you can get to the quarterback.
I mean, I've always believed that disruption is production, man. Like, I mean, again, it's the mantra that was created several years ago by, wasn't it Justin Mosqueda that came up with it? Or,
Yep.
And I've always believed in that measurable disruption in the pocket is a thing that matters, right? And I think when you're playing your entire career next to Micah Parsons, who, guess what, is gobbling up a lot of sacks, I think you may not have the sack number, but the fact that he's got as many pressures and QB hits as he does, I think shows you something. Look, I mean, explaining Osa, like, honestly, it's really more of a marker on whether you're watching the tape or not. Honestly, like,
well,
player, then you're probably not watching the tape.
I do. Yes, you are right. I do think there's some team building stuff in here, which we've talked about a little bit in previous shows. Like, is it smart to invest $21 million into Osa, $38 million into Micah? Is that the best way to build a defensive line or build a defense? I think you can have debates about that. But if you're saying Osa is just an average player or slightly above average player, that's where you're not watching.
I mean, honestly, we can discuss the money if you want, but I mean, look, he's being paid, like you said, 14th best defensive tackle. And what are you paying defensive tackles for? You can get a run defending defensive tackle anywhere for vet minimum and get a really decent guy who could probably stick in the middle and be a plug. You're paying for pass rush, and Osa Odighizuwa is one of the best pass rushing defensive tackles in football. So, I don't really get this argument. I'm thrilled about the signing. I think 21 million, when again we were talking like it could potentially be up to 25 million, depending. Yeah. If I'll put it this way, if this defensive tackle class that's coming in right now wasn't as incredible as it is, I guarantee you that Milton Williams and Osa would be rolling in $25 million plus contracts. Sure. So, I do think this is a good deal for the Cowboys.
One of the things that I've looked at, Landon, is that let's use PFF grades. And I know, again, they are not the end-all be-all, but I'm going to use the top 10 defensive tackles and grades this year. Chris Jones, Cam Hayward, Dexter Lawrence, Leonard Williams, Poona Ford, Calais Campbell, DeForest Buckner, Jeffrey Simmons, and Zach Sealer. What do all 10 of those defensive tackles have in common? They're all playing on their second, third, or even fourth contracts. Yeah. Defensive tackle is a position that is really hard to get good production right away. And generally, these guys that are really good, like Chris Jones and Lawrence and Williams, they get better as they get older. I would say a lot of times the peak of defensive tackles is like 28, 29, 30, because that's just when you have the requisite strength. You know how to play with technique. Osa's 20, I think he's 26 right now. He's missed one game, and that was due to COVID as a rookie. He's never missed a start. Other than that, these are the type of guys that you want to play because I do think he's an ascending player at a very important position.
Yeah, and again, like the point that people make, or he's undersized. I mean, it's the stuff that you garner by Googling Osa Odighizuwa and seeing how much he weighs. If you've never watched him play, you've never seen that he's a wrestler. He plays with incredible leverage, and that he has not missed a game due to injury. So again, like I think you have to watch. You have to look at the specifics here. You're right that maybe in a vacuum, I don't sign a 6'2", 280 pound defensive tackle that has X amount of sacks to a long-term deal, but I signed this one all day, every day, because I've seen this guy play and what he can do on the field and what he helps Micah do as well. Just like the way that they play off each other and the way he takes advantage of single teams as well. So, I do think that this was a good deal for the Cowboys. And I think that people that are kind of complaining about it are just trying to find something to complain about. This is a good deal for the Cowboys.
Well, I saw a tweet today. Actually, I'm going to throw my guy Connor onto the bus a little bit, but he's like, would you rather sign Osa to $21 million a year or sign like Javon Kinlaw, Dre Greenlaw, Jedrick Wills, and another defensive tackle? And I understand the thought process. Like this team has a lot of needs, right? And they definitely need depth. At the same time, I've hated the strategy of piecing out your money to 4 average players and letting an above average player difference maker walk. Give me the guy that I think can actually make a difference on Sunday in Osa. And again, I know the sack totals aren't there, but there have been multiple games this year where he was the difference in winning and losing. I would rather have that guy and fill in the depth other ways.
Well, you fill in the depth with all the money you're paying these defensive ends. Like, look, we'll talk about the potential that the Cowboys. We heard David Cantor speak today about some of his clients. The potential for the Cowboys to sign some other defensive ends. The Cowboys have always found ways to reduce their defensive ends to have them rush as pass rushers. So, look, if you're worried about depth, you're going to get snaps where you're having defensive ends playing snaps as a defensive tackle. You're going to be fine paying this guy that you can play at all three downs, the money that you're paying him, and still being able to supplement the depth with, the big bodies that you need to stop the run, and then the guys that can reduce down and be pass rushers on third down.
Absolutely. All right, let's talk about this one a little bit more far-fetched rumor about maybe the Cowboys trading up to pick number 1. We will get to that next. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen every single day. Let's talk about a rumor from Mike Florio that says the Cowboys have talked to the Tennessee Titans about potentially trying to get up to number 1. Here's his exact quote. I did hear yesterday, you hear all sorts of stuff, and I don't like the traffic and stuff I've heard because I don't know how accurate it is. But I did have somebody tell me that the Cowboys have talked to the Titans about moving up to number 1. Now, here's my general thoughts on this before we get into the weeds. I think teams have these kind of conversations all the time. Like, hey, like feelers, right? Hey, what would it cost to get up to number 1? Oh, you want 3 first-round picks on Micah Parsons? Yeah. Enjoy your latte. Like that's, what I mean? Like that's that kind of stuff. I do wonder what the Cowboys what they would need to give to get up to number 1 and who they would be targeting at that spot.
I love that we're still doing coffee references. By the way,
I know I'm going to do it all.
Honestly, I almost did a spit take when we were talking about this. So, look, I think a lot of that is that, right? Is that the Cowboys, I'm sure, are just trying to find out what the cost of business is for going up. If it's exceptionally cheap. Look, because I do think that there is something to the idea that, and you and I kind of talked about this before the show, that because there are no, surefire top end quarterback prospects that like teams are going up for, if Tennessee wants to trade back from 1 to kind of get some picks because they're not necessarily interested in taking a quarterback, unfortunately for them, they're probably not going to get the same kind of bounty that they would if you were going up for a, Trevor Lawrence type, quarterback prospect that was clear number 1, right? So I think that there is an opportunity for the Cowboys to at least see, hey, how much of a discount are you willing to give? Like, how desperate are you potentially to trade back and get some more picks? Because, look, I mean, and you and I talked about this too, like if the deal was reasonable enough and you had an opportunity to go up and get a Travis Hunter, what would you be willing to give up for that? And is it lined up with Tennessee? If Tennessee's sitting there and they've got no offers, right? And they've heard everyone else is kind of comfortable with just sitting because they assume Tennessee at this point is going to take Abdul Carter, let's say, right? But they're desperate to try to just get more picks. It could be that the Cowboys are one of the only teams picking up the phone to call them and willing to kind of give them maybe a reduced offer that may be at a deep discount compared to what you normally would get trading up from 12 to 1 in a normal year.
My general philosophy is that you don't trade up in drafts in round 1.
Yeah.
For anybody except for a quarterback, right? Because more often than not, the teams that are trading up, you're just not getting your value. A lot of these teams have overconfidence and their ability to project and draft these guys, right? Having said that, your options if you're trading up are it's either Abdul Carter or Travis Hunter if you're Dallas, right? I understand the idea of pairing Abdul Carter and Micah Parsons together. That would be really fun. But it comes back to the same conversation that we had with Cody Alexander a couple of weeks ago. Can you afford to play 2 sub 255-pound defensive ends? I think it'd be okay if you had Micah and Abdul, but I think ideally they would like to get some size there. Would you agree?
Yeah, and honestly, like that's not who I would be taking if I was trading up to go to number one.
No.
I'm taking Hunter, and the reason I would do it is because then I could at least convince myself and convince all the fans that hey, giving up 2 first-round picks for a guy that plays two positions makes sense.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's like, oh, I want to get the top wide receiver and the top cornerback in the draft all in one move. Bung's your uncle. That we done it, right? Like
that's the thing. That's why I agree with you, by the way. Like I think it should, if you're going to trade up, it's Travis Hunter. I also think there's some, again, you hate to think this way, but there would be some marketing things that would be really fun. Like if you had Travis Hunter for the Cowboys, like the Cowboys love the brand. Having Travis Hunter do podcasts and do a lot of commercials and recreating stuff with Dion would be a lot of fun.
I mean, honestly, the NFL may just start leaning on Tennessee to be like, hey, maybe you should knock down that price a little bit more. Let Dallas trade up and get this guy. Like it's like it would almost be too perfect. The Deion Sanders protege to end up back in Dallas. Yeah, I mean, look, it makes a ton of sense, and I don't think trading up to number one makes a ton of sense. I do think in any other circumstance, I would say absolutely not for a non-quarterback. Absolutely not. But if you're telling me I get a top of the draft two-way player who can legitimately play both positions, that changes the angles for me in a lot of ways.
Here's my take, though. Why do you need to trade up to number one? Because I think a lot of people are assuming Abdul Carter goes 1. The buzz out of Indy is that Cam Ward is going to go 2 to Cleveland. And let's say it's Shedeur to the Giants at 3, or maybe the Raiders trade up to 3, and that's Shedeur. Maybe you only need to go to 4 to go get Travis Hunter. And I wonder if going from 12 to 1 just doesn't seem realistic to me. But going from 12 to 4 seems a little bit more realistic.
Well, I also think that there's, if you're serious about actually doing this, that is the way to handle this, right? To wait and see if he makes it to 4, that's more palatable. Let's pull the trigger. Let's see if they're even interested in dropping back that far. I do think that the reason you go and talk about, like, if you wanted to try to get this deal done before the draft, you can't trade to 4 if you're trying to get Hunter. You can't. No. Like you'd have to go to 1 to ensure that this works, because the worst thing that could happen is you make a trade to 4 before the draft and then he gets picked at 3, and then suddenly you're stuck at 4 with all the same kind of quality of guys that you would have had at 12, except one or 2 less picks. So I think if you're like going for it and you want to like be certain of it, and I think that there's benefit to paying a little bit extra for that certainty if that's what your plan is, then you probably have to go to the first overall pick. Otherwise, I think the more realistic plan, if Hunter is something that they really secretly very much desire, it would be, let's sweat it out for 3 picks. Let's see what happens when he lands at 4, and then we'll call them and give them everything we've got and see if they're interested.
It'd be fun. It wouldn't be the smartest business way to build a team, but my gosh, it would be fun. We were trying to get the Cowboys to tank mid-season so that we wouldn't have to trade up from 12 to 1. But here's what I'll say. Last thing, you can never say never in the NFL, but I will say there are a lot more younger GMs that are in charge of making these decisions, where I think 10, 15 years ago, going from 1 to 12 is like nobody would ever do that. But I do wonder if some of these teams like the Titans are like, drafting Travis Hunter or Abdul Carter isn't going to change our trajectory that much. But if we got, pick a name, Michael Williams at 12, picked up 2 first-round picks, that's how we start rebuilding this the right way. And yeah, our fans are going to be upset with us, but if we're adding a couple first-round picks and doing the tank the right way, maybe that is our fastest way to become relevant again. It's not too dissimilar from what Philadelphia did, like when they were trading all these picks to go get 2-3 first rounders in every one of these drafts.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that there's definitely going to be people on different kind of timelines and different sort of team building, I guess, points, right? And I do agree that I think that there probably are more folks that are looking at like the way Howie does business and thinking, yeah, maybe being more aggressive in whichever way we're going is a way that we should handle this.
Pick one lane, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, that certainly could, and it has, I think in the past, promoted a lot of volatility in the draft, a lot of kind of craziness that's happened. So yeah, that's again, kind of to your point, you can never really say never on some of this stuff because I mean, look what happened last year with Atlanta, right? They signed a quarterback to a huge deal and they end up drafting a quarterback in the top 10. So sometimes it's really just difficult to know exactly the full thinking of what's going on inside these teams. And so, partly it's because sometimes there's multiple, schools of thought in each team, right? And so it's a power struggle that we're not seeing, and it all kind of unfolds on draft day, and it's a lot of fun.
All right, let's talk about some more Cowboy rumors coming out of the combine. We will get to that next. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Draft Show with Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez. Now that the season is over, get the latest draft rankings, rumors, and news every day. Find Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. All right, Landon, David Cantor, who represents several Dallas Cowboy players, spoke on 105.3 The Fan this morning, and offered some really good nuggets. The first is that DeMarcus Lawrence is not considering retiring at all. He wants to play. This is some news that we were wondering about earlier in the week.
Yeah.
Now, he said the bad news is that he's a free agent and that there are other teams that are going to be interested in him. Now that we know he wants to play, do you think the Cowboys are going to bring him back?
Maybe can we talk about the entirety of what David Cantor said, because I think it does play into our thoughts here.
Yeah. So he also represents Jordan Lewis, Rico Dowdle, Chauncey Golston, Nick Vigil, and Izzy Makamo, and he was very optimistic that the Cowboys were going to re-sign all of those guys. Lawrence was the only one where he was like, "Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. We're meeting with the Cowboys on Friday," but. He actually, one of the things he said was, I think the Cowboys might want to get younger on the defensive line.
So the reason, that he brought that, I wanted to include that is obviously that last line you just mentioned. But on top of that, Chauncey Golston has now entered the chat, folks. I mean, this was a guy that I assumed was long gone from the Cowboys, right? Had a breakout season last year, really played some good football. If there's possibility of him coming back to the Cowboys, I think that may be, and again, adding that combined to that last quote that you gave, I think that may be the key to maybe why they don't necessarily bring DeMarcus Lawrence back. Or if they do, they bring him back on a reduced contract.
Well, I saw a couple reports today that people around the league think Lawrence is going to get like a 1-year deal worth $3 to $4 million, where Golston might get double that. Do you think at this stage of their careers, Golston is worth double what DeMarcus Lawrence might get?
I mean, I think that's hard it's hard to phrase it like that, right? Like, I mean, like I don't think in a vacuum that Golston is twice the player that Lawrence is right now.
Lawrence is a better player than Golston, but you're factoring in age, how many snaps they can play, injury history,
and how they can play too. Because I do think you could reduce Golston inside even more than you can Lawrence, right? Yeah. I think I do think that those are appropriate numbers for both of those players. Again, it is tough to phrase it like he's making twice as much money, but yes, I think Golston at $6 million a year and DeMarcus Lawrence at $3.5 to $4 million a year. That those are reasonable numbers to me.
But I don't think. Again, I could be wrong. I don't think the Cowboys are going to bring back both of these guys. No, I think it would be one at most, and there's a chance that they both leave. But I think you look at the depth chart, Micah Parsons, Marshawn Kneeland, Sam Williams. I think there's room on the roster for one vet defensive end. Maybe you bring back Carl Lawson. But I said this last night on the Fan. I would be shocked at this point if the Cowboys are drafting any other position in round one other than defensive line. And I think that's going to factor in here as well.
Yeah. I mean, that certainly is a possibility. I mean, one of the things you and I talked about was that, originally we weren't exactly sure what D-Law's, situation was personally, whether he wanted to play or not, but that maybe the Cowboys could slow play this a little bit. I don't know that that's not still the case, that maybe that they can kind of wait until after the draft to see exactly what Lawrence's situation is. I mean, maybe Lawrence is looking to sign before the draft, but I think if the Cowboys go in and they let's say they draft another defensive tackle and not like another defensive end, then maybe they come out of the draft and still want one more, and they call D-Law up and see if they can work something out. But if D-Law is like looking to get a deal done before the draft, then it may have been the last snap we've seen him play with the Cowboys.
Yeah, I don't know how to feel about it, because what we saw from Lawrence early this year, he was awesome. I mean, he was dominant in the Giants game, but now we're talking about a player that does have a long history of lower body injuries, specifically foot injuries.
Mm-hmm.
Makes you nervous, where I feel like someone like Chauncey Golston, and generally my philosophy is in free agency, you want to pay for future production.
Yeah.
I feel like Golston is an ascending player.
Agreed.
At the same time, I also recognize Lawrence is a better player right now. So at what point will those two guys cross?
Yeah.
I don't know, but this is what the Cowboys are going to have to figure it out over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, and it's tough, right? I think the part of the problem is that we just never considered the fact that the Cowboys potentially re-signing Golston. We just assumed that he kind of played his way out of what the Cowboys were willing to pay him. But I mean, like, just to examine that for a second, I think Golston, you nailed it, is very much an ascending player. He played his very best football this year. He's always been a guy that has had a pretty high floor. It's always just been about unlocking more of that ceiling. And I feel like we've seen a little bit more of that. And I think the real difference you've seen is that they never really were able to kind of get him working well as a power edge player. Right. And it feels like this year he really kind of grew into that more than he had in previous seasons. So the fact that you're getting a guy who can actually potentially play first and second down, run games, run defense, and then potentially reduce down and rush the passer next to Osa or whoever else as a defensive tackle. Obviously, that has incredible value, and that's kind of how they were using Lawrence, or have been using Lawrence these last few years. So yeah, I think it very much becomes the question of, do you fully have faith in Golston to continue on the trend that we've seen, not only just the last year, but maybe the last 2 years, that as he is an ascending player and that his best football is still to come? Or should you trust the fact that what you've got when DeMarcus Lawrence is healthy, and that may be currently, as we stand at right now, a better football player than where Golston is, as we stand on February 27th.
Golston reminds me a lot of when we got to Dorrance Armstrong at the end of his rookie contract, where just starting to see some of the peaks. The Cowboys gave Armstrong a 2-year deal. I think it was 2 years, $12 million. Absolutely got the money worth out of him. Like Armstrong, Golston also plays on a bunch of special teams units. He can play, I think, in almost any scheme, and I think he fits Matt Eberflus's defense really well. Yeah. That would be a guy that I would really, really like to see the Cowboys bring back. One last thing, Jordan Lewis. It sounds like the Cowboys would like to bring back Jordan Lewis, but David Cantor said there's going to be a heavy market for him. Do we expect him to come back?
Yeah, it's going to be a good question. His market is going to be very interesting, right? Because he is a guy that has played really, really good football as of late, but he is a 30-year-old, 31-year-old maybe, nickel only really corner. I mean, I think he can play some outside a little bit, but he's athletically limited. He's not going to get more athletic as these years go on. He's not abnormally large, right? He's not huge. So, but he has the type of physical mentality that you don't worry about him holding up as a run player in the slot. It's just a very kind of interesting mix of variables here. So I am very kind of interested to see what his market is. Look, if the numbers are right, absolutely bring him back, especially in light of, just needing bodies while you're waiting for your star corner to come back from injury. And while Diggs is recovering, you at least have two guys you feel really solid about. And numbers wise, you're not. I mean, because that honestly was as much of a problem last year as anything else. It wasn't just talent. I mean, the Cowboys didn't have enough corners to physically
No.
play on the field that had ever played NFL football
Nope.
before. So signing him to a deal that's at least somewhat reasonable, I think would make a ton of sense. But I could also see a situation where, he's played so well these last few years and teams have so much cap space now. Some team just drops a $8 million contract in his lap or something. And you're like, good luck to you, Jordan. I love you. And you've been a great Cowboy and I hope you have a great career.
All right, that is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Cowboys your first listen every single day. On tomorrow's show, we'll talk about some of the combine results for the guys that are actually doing stuff at the combine. We'll see. Did get some stuff on Mason Graham, 32-inch arms. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Go download the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. Follow Landon on Twitter at McCoolBCB. I'm at Marcus_Mosier. We'll see you on Friday.